2014 will go down as the warmest year around the globe in recorded history.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Your show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
The rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
There's pretty good odds that if you're listening to this, you're already familiar with 2040. But if you're not, it's a documentary that came out last year, in 2019, about the world we could have by 2040, if we fully embraced and engaged with the challenge and opportunity of the climate crisis. Now, after extensive touring of the film and many live events, the director of 2040, Damon Gameau, is holding some webinars where he's chatting to some of the key movers and shakers and changemakers in the climate change community. And to get things started, we're happy to be sharing his first webinar with you here, adapted for the Climactic podcast. To give a little bit of context, we've added in some clips with some more information about what Damon and Zali are talking about. And wherever you're listening to this, if you just look below the player, you'll find in the show notes some links to some other Climactic episodes we think you'll enjoy, such as interviews with the young people behind Climate Leaders, the group that helped campaign for Zali, and even an episode featuring Damon that was kindly shared to us from the podcast Regeneration. We hope you enjoy this, and it's a thrill to be able to work again with the 2040 team. So thank you, Damon, Kim, Anna C., and Anna K. Enjoy.
Welcome. This is another of our Towards 2040 series. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from the lands of the Arakwal people and the Bundjalung Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and their metaphor of custodianship of the land could never be more important than right now. Very fortunate to be speaking tonight to Zali Steggall, who is the independent MP for the seat of Warringah in New South Wales. She's also the instigator of the Climate Change Act, which we'll talk about. She's Australia's most successful alpine skier, and seeing how busy her schedule is, if there were Zoom frequent user points, she would already have access to the Zoom Premium Lounge. Zali, welcome. Thanks for your time.
Darren, lovely to be here. Electronically.
Do you want to just, I just thought, start by sharing, what's any reflections for you on lockdown, or how's it been for you? How's the juggle been, this time? What's it meant for you in terms of reflections of where we're at?
Look, it's been quite interesting. I've got to say, we took action fairly early as an electoral office in terms of our staff and volunteers that would come into the office. I had everyone working remotely very quickly. Clearly, we had to amend our plans around the climate change bill because that had been planned to be presented on the 23rd of March, which was essentially when lockdown commenced. It's been interesting. I'm the household, 2 working adults working from home, 3 teenage kids, 1 doing his HSC. So we've definitely experienced all those challenges of having the kids at home, trying to balance, not too much social media and electronics, keeping track of the work, as well as a lot of people very distressed in the electorate. So really putting in place those systems, to respond to emails, make sure people are getting communication, getting the information they need to be safe, but also, how to navigate all the information that was coming from the government. And a lot of constituents stuck overseas. So we had a lot of dealing with the Home Affairs and trying to get, people back and safe. So it's been really busy. I know a lot of people have looked at, we're not sitting in Parliament as much, but it has been incredibly busy.
I want to just dive straight in because I know we haven't got a lot of time and there's some already questions coming in, but obviously this is an incredible moment for us in terms of an opportunity to rebuild post-corona. I think some of the decisions we make in the next 6 months will be felt for decades to come, and I think a lot of people understand that. Some people might not be familiar with the commission that was set up by the Morrison government just to, I guess, deal with some of the logistics of right now, but also look at some of the opportunities to where that stimulus spending might go as we emerge from this. And of the 15 members of that commission, about 6 of them have very strong ties to extractive industries, gas in particular. The chairman, Nev Power, of that commission is already sitting on works at a company that are a gas exploration company. There's no one from the renewable energy sector on that commission. And I know you've just raised a few questions, and thank you for that, about the transparency of that commission, an unelected committee that is potentially going to be dealing with a lot of our public money. They've already become a magnet for lobby groups. I know that much. Can you just talk about what you're doing there and some of the questions that you've been asking?
Yeah, look, I think what we do need to remember, there's no blueprint. I think a crisis like this, government and the Prime Minister had to move quickly. We were seeing, in March, we had shortages of toilet paper, you had supply questions. So I think the genesis for the Coordination Commission started very much out of making sure we had good supply routes and there weren't any issues, especially for more remote and more exposed communities. So I can understand that was maybe the beginning or the thinking behind that coordination, and how would we coordinate between states and lockdowns and across industries, for example, and how do you create, for example, a COVID-safe workspace for those industries that needed to continue. And so, look, there are a lot of eminent, extremely reputable people on the commission, and I don't have an issue with a commission per se, because in fact, in the climate change bill, I want to see a climate change commission established. And ironically, the criticism from a lot of the coalition was, how can you have an unelected body advise government on policy? The irony that that's exactly what the coalition's done, I hope, means that we can put to bed those concerns and objections about the climate change bill. The concerns around the Coordination Commission, though, is there was no consultation at the time of announcement, and I don't understand that there was any public sort of process in terms of what the skill base should be on the commission, who should be on it, whether it should actually be independent. And it was very much I think they were captain's pick in terms of who was appointed. Now, it is heavily geared towards fossil fuels or directors with fossil fuel experience and backgrounds. Now, when I asked the Prime Minister about that in question time last week in Parliament, about, how can the Australian people trust the decisions on what this Coordination Commission is doing in circumstances where we have no clear terms of reference. What's been put up on the website for the NCCC itself indicates that it has broad powers of advice, that it is going to seek all information, broad information, to advise the government. Now, we have a Senate inquiry into the coronavirus response. The CEO, Mr. Harris, appeared before that last week, again in Parliament, and indicated that even he was quite unsure as to all the roles and activities of the Commission. He said it was opaque. He was very unclear about the conflicts of interest of not just the Commission, people on the Commission, but he indicated there are a number of advisors, or he described them as appendage people sitting, I guess, below the Coordination Commission with a role in subgroups. So my understanding from people I've spoken to, there is a manufacturing task force, there is a non-for-profit task force, there are likely to be an energy task force. These task force have people on it. Now, Mr. Harris couldn't even tell the Senate inquiry who, give a list of exactly who is there in an advisory role. He was unclear that they were also subject to any kind of conflicts, disclosure of conflicts of duty. And so it raises a lot of questions of exactly what is the role of this Coordination Commission? Yeah. What are its boundaries? What are the scopes of its duties? What powers does it have? Now, Mr. Harris made it clear it has been lobbied. It is receiving proposals. There's no direct public pathway for that. So clearly it's if you know someone on it, you can present a submission, which is not how this should work. This is too vital a time. And it seems to be very arbitrary who they're talking to and who they're not. And I certainly have not heard from the chair of the Commission that there is any focus that they are looking, for example, at an energy task force or a manufacturing task force, but they are doing that with an overarching guideline of reducing emissions and decarbonising and focusing on lowest cost, best long-term impact for Australia. Now, I think that's concerning, and I think legitimately we need to be asking questions.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you doing that. I think one of the appendages you mentioned there is a man named Andrew Leversis, and he's been talking about a sort of a trans-Australian gas pipeline for a long time, and I think it's pretty convenient that one of the first suggestions of this committee is for that pipeline to happen, a $6 billion pipeline. I mean, if any, this is the time not to be transporting gas across the country. This is the time for interconnectors of renewable energy. And I think maybe what people might not be familiar with, because we often hear this narrative that gas is this sort of transition fuel, it's clean, but some of the research now that's saying that even a 2.8% leak of that gas, which can happen at extraction or distribution, can actually be more deleterious to the planet than coal because of the heating gas that methane is. So really, we know BP have said there's about 3.2% of gas leak, so it's already a problem. Do you want to talk maybe about, this is an opportunity for our country to really change the way we've been doing things and not use these 20th century technologies, but really embrace what is out there now that are going to create more resilience, create huge jobs that we need, all these economic benefits that we could have out of Australia of being this renewable superpower, a land we could use. Do you want to talk about that more and how it relates, I guess, to your Climate Change Act and the opportunities that we should be embracing in this time instead of reverting to these old ways?
Yeah, and look, we have to be realistic. The Reserve Bank has made it clear if we want a chance to avoid a deep recession, business as usual is not going to cut it. It's going to take reform and it's going to take something more than that. So that means there is an opportunity for the Prime Minister at this point. There's an opportunity to reset and be future focused. And I think this will be a real test of what his legacy will be, is will he be up to the task of the opportunity. Now, there's no doubt that the rebuild needs, we need a mixture of energy sources in our rebuild. But what I think we need to be is technology agnostic, but focused on what will achieve and deliver the best outcomes. Now, our best long-term outcomes and our commitment, the Australian government's commitment, is to keep global warming to under 2 degrees. Now, that requires net zero by 2050 at the latest. And we know from the science that we need to drastically reduce emissions from the course that we're currently on. So it means there needs to be a reset and there needs to be a change, and there should be a benchmark by which any decision is made or any investment of public money is made. It must tick more than one box and it must be productive towards that long-term goal of reducing our emissions. We have to balance that budget. So I'm very concerned that at the moment we're talking about projects like the $6 billion gas pipeline that has essentially been discredited as economically just not a viable project. So very concerning. And look, the minister's also constantly talking about a gas-led recovery. And again, that really goes against evidence. We've got AEMO's ISP plan indicates gas as being a 1 to 2%. We have great potential in renewables. We have a focus on hydrogen, which is really important, but we need to be really clear that it is green hydrogen that we would be focused on, because we need to, for keeping the price down, it needs to be a renewable fueled hydrogen. It really is important that we grasp the opportunity of where we're at. And I feel it so much also from the generation that's impacted. It's been a really interesting crisis in that the health crisis has overwhelmingly impacted the older generation. And it tends to be, it's not a rule, but generally a lot of the older generation is more resistant to change and to stronger action on reducing our emissions. So I do think there is a little bit of an interesting reset that needs to happen there as well, because the cost of this rebuild, the stimulus, is going to fall on the shoulders of the younger generation. And they are the ones who have been the most impacted by job losses through this crisis, whose future is most impacted, because there's no doubt this is going to impact the economy for some time, and who will also be the generation to bear the cost of climate impacts if we do not change our course. So I think there is a duty to a whole generation that must be front of mind in the decision making at this point. And it really can form part of that. So where does the climate change bill fit in?
Hi, I'm Zali Steggall, Independent Member of Parliament for Warringah. On March 23, I'll introduce a climate change bill to Parliament to help us protect our homes, our well-being, our economy and our environment from the changing climate. New Zealand, Germany, the UK, many countries have a Climate Change Act. It's a framework that brings down their emissions. We need one too. We are feeling the impacts of climate change. We need to protect our homes, our communities, our way of life. With the Climate Change Act, we will have a sensible plan to protect our jobs, the Australian economy and our environment. Then we will all prosper together. Let's say enough with party politics. Climate change is a matter of conscience. Join your voice to mine. Say yes at climateactnow.com.au.
From part of that. So where does the climate change bill fit in? Well, the climate change bill, it is based on legislation that was passed in the UK in 2008. It sets the long-term goal of net zero by 2050. Now, I know from many points of view, we need to get there sooner, but we, I think, at the very least need to set that outer marker. We need to draw the line in the sand so that we have that goal and we are accelerating our work and our research and investment to get to that goal. It is widely accepted from many countries around the world. It's widely accepted by most of our private large corporations. They generally have those goals of net zero by 2050. And it's policy or legislation in all of our states. So I do think it's a strange situation to have our energy reduction minister, the outlier, out completely on his own in terms of not accepting that net zero by 2050 is a must of our benchmark that we need to set ourselves by. So that's where the climate change bill, I think, is even more relevant now than ever in terms of what is the benchmark by which we need to measure the actions we take with the economy, with the rebuild, out of this crisis. And we need to make sure we get bang for buck. We can't have ideological investment, so that does not have that long-term return. And the long-term return means for it to attract private investment, it simply has to be in a low emission direction.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I was reading through the bill today and it feels quite applicable, but I think some of the countries that have probably done the best during this COVID crisis have been the ones that have sort of set politics aside and ideology. They've let the data and the science really come forward. They've made decisions on that science. They've formed committees around that. They've communicated very clearly. Do you think there'll be learnings from that here? I mean, I think about the opportunity we have to do that around climate and whatnot. And I noticed in your bill that you even had a sort of an annual risk assessment of seeing where we're at. Are there things that need to be done? And this is orchestrated by a committee based on the data. Can you talk more to that in terms of what are the learnings from COVID, do you think, in terms of how we've made decisions apply that to climate change?
There's no doubt that, and I think this is going to be a test of the Prime Minister's character in that he has been willing to accept the science and medical advice on this crisis, and he has acted decisively, and we have done really well, and he should be, congratulated for that we have avoided a health crisis. We are doing so well compared to the rest of the world. But I think it's a partnership between the government that's taken strong action and the Australian people who have been willing to do it, because there's been a real incursion into rights, individual rights, and we've accepted that for the greater good. Now, I think that shows, and also early action is decisive. Now, we know on climate and on emission reduction, it will be cheaper and more effective to act early, and it will minimise the cost down the road. So I sincerely hope that there is a maturity in the government to actually look at the outcome of the actions that they've taken on this crisis and show a maturity of being able to embrace the same approach on the biggest risk we face, being climate. the budget we most need to balance is our emissions budget. And at the moment, we are so deeply in the red, it's scary.
Yeah.
So I really hope for that there's that opportunity to accept that it's been shown to work in our response to this crisis. We need to put it into effect on the other crisis. Now, before the lockdown, I asked the Prime Minister in Parliament, what was the cost of not achieving the Paris target, of not staying below 2 degrees of warming? And he had no answer because the cost is unimaginable. And it's not just a health and environment cost, it's actually an economic cost. The impact to the economy will be far, far greater. We're starting to get those numbers, like University of Melbourne have done that study, but that's a really important point that we need to focus on because it is the biggest risk ahead to the economy. So a big part of the climate change bill is once we lock in that net zero, that long-term target, we have 5-year emission reduction budgets so that we can assess how we get there. And that's across every sector. We have some sectors will be easier to achieve than others, like energy. Transport will not be so hard. Agriculture will be harder. Industry, manufacturing, harder as well. But a lot of those are interlinked. And there's a lot of people putting a lot of work into coming up with plans. Climate Works, for example, recently put out a report that shows how we can get there across all sectors. So if there's another thing we've learned from 2020, 2020 has been a big year. With the bushfires, as we've seen, we're exposed. There is, the risk management is a huge part of how we need to proceed into the future. And that requires regular assessment. And I think it requires independent assessment so that the public can have confidence. Just as we've seen the premiers of all our states and the Prime Minister stand next to the Chief Medical Officer to give us the political decision, and then the medical officer gives us the medical update and the reasoning. I think it's really important that we have that partnership between the science and the politicians or the leaders in explaining why certain steps are necessary. And I think that we can progress out of the climate wars that Australia's had for 10 years into a much more, I think there needs to be bipartisanship on where our future is. There just isn't room for the kind of divisive oppositional politics that we've seen for so long.
I feel often, as I'm sure you do, I feel quite hopeful when I see what the states are doing in terms of their own reductions and their energy. And you think of South Australia, it'll probably be 100% renewable before 2030, the way they're going, what WA are doing, what Tasmania are doing, Victoria, even Queensland are starting to do these things. So, can you delineate there between how important is it to actually have a federal national target of 2050 when the states are sort of going on their own and cranking and really getting things done? What is the significance of having this sort of united plan? Is it about this sort of bipartisanship? Is that the sort of the more important element here of a collective vision and goal?
One of the things I am calling for is, and I will be incorporating into the bill, that I think the National Cabinet needs to continue. And I think we need a National Cabinet involvement when it comes to our response to climate change and a national energy policy and emission reduction. All the states are far in front of the Commonwealth Government as far as the steps they're taking and being proactive, which is really good. And I think the National Cabinet is a way in which I think it would be really important that the Prime Minister actually have to deal with and acknowledge where the states and the commitments the states have made. So I definitely want to see a continuation of the National Cabinet. I think it's been proven to be effective in a crisis in handling the differences of each state, that it doesn't stifle, it doesn't diminish the voice of each state, but it allows for a coordinated response, which is so important on an issue like our emission reduction and climate change impacts. In terms of do we still need leadership? Well, we do, because there are, just as in our response to the crisis, it was necessary to lock down our international borders and have quarantine. States could make decisions within their state boundaries, but we needed an overall policy and approach as well. So I do believe it's important. We need that leadership, and I know the private sector is calling for that policy certainty. Spoken with, from BCA to AIG to the superannuation groups to multiple sectors, and they all overwhelmingly want policy certainty and stability. The lack of a national energy policy makes it very difficult. At a time like this, where we want to be capturing as much private investment as possible to stimulate the economy, create, really boost industries and manufacturing, we have so many opportunities, green steel, green aluminium, there are so many opportunities, but we do need private sector investment, and we will miss out on that investment if we don't have policy certainty.
And as you said, there's an opportunity. I mean, I guess the great fear is, and probably the Prime Minister's biggest decision is what to do with when the JobKeeper sort of allowances, when he pulls that away, because where are these people going to go in terms of jobs? And what an opportunity to actually stimulate and create some wonderful jobs that would actually build us a better future, whether it's large projects around the rail or renewables or the green steel, whatever it might be, we're going to need more jobs. And I think that's going to be a pivotal moment for him. I just wanted to ask you again about, I've noticed like Trump today announced that, they were going to sort of strip any regulation while the economy builds, which has been a huge blow for sort of any environmental protection in the US. And I've noticed even here that under the sort of, while everyone's focused on COVID, that a few things have snuck through. I know the Minerals Council have been very busy, that the coal mine expansion under the Sydney has been approved. Are there anything else that you're sort of cognizant of that we need to be careful about what's going on behind the scenes, especially in terms of environment?
This reservoir is in one of 5 main water catchments in Greater Sydney, supplying drinking water to millions of people. Soon, it will also be home to coal mining. Peabody Energy has been allowed to extend its metropolitan mine underneath the Warrenora Reservoir. Many people in the community are divided about the economic benefits of coal and its impact on climate change. Some say it's time for serious decisions to be made on jobs, fossil fuels and the environment. Nicola Gage, Al Jazeera, Sydney.
Yeah, there's been this sort of narrative of, to boost the economy, we need to, cut the green tape or cut down regulation. Now, all you're going to achieve with that is there's going to be short-term bad decisions made and bad projects approved that will have a long-term cost to the Australian people. And I don't think that's acceptable. So that will be short-term greed for a few at the expense of many. So I definitely don't agree with that. I think that we have an opportunity for a planned recovery, and that's where I think there really is, it's important. So look, there is the review of the EPBC Act as well. There's a number of areas where, yes, I can see there is going to be a challenge and attempts at winding back environmental protections. And I just don't see how that can, we cannot afford to do that in the wake of the bushfires. I mean, keep in mind, we still have the Royal Inquiry into the impacts of the bushfires. A lot of our regions are not just reeling from the lockdown of the virus, but they were already decimated by the bushfires. So we need to be very careful about winding back environmental protections and what the benefit is. I think there is a lot more to be done. Minister Andrews announced today, talked a lot about, for example, focusing on manufacturing of batteries, for example, locally. And I know ARENA and the CEFC are focused on increasing our storage capacities, so batteries to back up the renewables, which is really important. I think there's huge opportunity there. Many would have read Ross Garnaut's book. We have the capacity to be an energy superpower. We need to harness that potential. And it's certainly not going to be by snapping back to fossil fuels. So, yes, those little things that slip under the radar are really concerning. There is some legislation due to come before the Parliament in relation to the grid reliability, and these attempts or foreshadowed amendments to the mandate of the CEFC are concerning. We had the King Review released yesterday. Again, it was a cherry-picked body. A group of individuals did the review, heavily fossil fuel sort of experience. It was a circumventing from using the Climate Change Authority, who is doing its own review at the same time. So there's a real question of why the Energy Minister's gone down that path. And the recommendations of broadening the focus of the CFC and ARENA to include projects like gas or clean coal is concerning. And again, today there was a lot of conversation again around CCS. Now, it's like having a 10-year deja vu to have that conversation. It's just not bang for buck, and the Australian economy cannot afford this kind of ideological investment. We need effective investment.
So would you say, I mean, in your short time in Parliament now, I mean, it seems what's so obvious now in our country is this, whether it's this concentrated media landscape that we have, really, and I'm interested in storytelling, obviously, that we have these gatekeepers of a narrative in this country. We didn't have any real lobbyists in the 80s in our country. We now have, somewhere around 5,000 lobbyists. It feels our Parliament has really been hijacked from the outside and is really blocking a lot of the things that just should be happening and are happening in other parts of the world. What's your take on that in terms of your experience so far and just your observations from the inner sanctum?
I don't think I get to see the inner sanctum just yet, but look, it's been interesting. I am concerned at the disconnect between conversations you can have with individual MPs as to what their beliefs are and focus, but yet the party politics of it, that at the end of the day, especially, I mean, Labor has a different caucus, but the coalition is supposed to be the party of the free vote, and yet MPs will toe the party line, essentially. Now, I assume within their party room they have a process of deciding the decisions and the direction they're going to go on policies, but I find there's a really big disconnect in the individuals may say they believe in, and yet their actions do not match those beliefs. So I think there's a real question of electorates holding those individuals to account. Are MPs there to represent a party or represent an electorate? And that needs to be debated, But yeah, the lobbyists and those influences are really concerning. I think that we have got a concentrated media in Australia. It's really important we maintain freedom of the press, important to have a strong national broadcaster and the ABC. They're really important issues to make sure people are informed. The power and of lobby groups is interesting. It is concerning. We need more transparency around donation, and we have very little legislation around that. There's a clear double standard in how, for example, as an independent, the disclosure I need to provide compared to what a party provides, vastly different. We still don't have any truth in political advertising laws, and we don't have a national integrity commission. So there's a number of issues we're pushing for to try and improve that level of accountability by the government, and to be in a position to scrutinise the decisions that are being made, to make sure that they are, that they pass the smell test, that they are illegitimate, everything is good. So
I think it's obvious. I think that people have lost faith, I think, in politics, understandably, and especially I think I talk to a lot of the younger generation who really struggle to relate or understand or connect with democracy, which is a great challenge. Do you think the future might be we see more independents running like you are? Are we going to see governments form like in Finland, where it's a coalition of 5 independents, early 30s women, I might add? Is that kind of going to break this sort of duality we've been stuck in for too long that just really isn't getting us to the places we need to go? What are your thoughts on that, again, from being inside?
Yeah, look, I think that would be much better for our democracy and much better for the long-term interest of Australia. The crossbench is a great place. So I think more members of the crossbench would be good to challenge the debate and make sure that the parliament is a place of debate, not just two teams sort of, slanging at each other and not really looking for positive outcomes. Where I'm also concerned is the coalition, I think, is really held to ransom by its junior partner. I think the Nationals are really quite unstable. That creates a situation of a minority having a disproportionately large impact on the stability of government, and that they have proven themselves to be quite prepared to wreck the joint. And that is really damaging and not in the best interest of democracy in our country. So I always find, I appreciate that we have that you have all opinions, and that's the beauty of democracy, is that you have a lot of different views. But I'm concerned when certain more extreme views do not hesitate to speak extremely loudly, and we don't hear the counterparts. So from within the coalition, we hear a lot of the denier voices when it comes to climate. We don't hear the strong other voices, and we don't see strong speaking up for good legislation or good amendments. I think at the last election we had a number of calling themselves the modern liberals. Now, where are they when it comes to standing up for the modern values and good legislation or good amendments? What can young people do, or what are all the people? Look, you have to take control. This is democracy. Your vote counts. Being disillusioned with it or accepting it as being a broken system is not good enough. You wouldn't accept that in your personal life for something that really impacts you. And I don't think it's okay to accept that as far as our politics. Now, that was my situation. I had to find myself a bit over a year ago in terms of I was unhappy with the status quo, but there's no point on being an armchair critic and complaining if you're not prepared to do something about it. Now, for me, it meant putting it on the line and putting myself up as a candidate. But for over 1,400 people in Warringah, it was come and be a volunteer and support the campaign and be a voice for change. Now, that is the only way an independent can get up, is by having the support of their community. You just have to be, it has to be local, and it has to be support of grassroots community. So we all have that potential, everyone, so if you are dissatisfied with the status quo, you have to get involved to change it.
Great. And can you talk about, because a lot of people, say, will it make a difference if I write to my MP? Do they actually going to read that letter? Is my harassing all for nothing? Can you give people a kernel of hope to say, yes, their penetrating emails are frustrating. They do accumulate, and people should be on the front foot with that stuff.
There's no doubt about it that electoral officers are very busy dealing with emails. I guess does have an impact. But if it's all it is an email with no follow-up, I think it's asking for a meeting, but letting people know within your community if your local MP is not willing to give you a meeting or is not willing to give you an answer, or if all you're getting is a rote answer but nothing really engaging on the issue. Is that an answer you would be prepared to accept on something else that was maybe more personal? Then why are you accepting it from your representative? I think you have to challenge that, but also, as much as we have a media monopoly, a strong sort of concentrated media in Australia, we are in a day and age where we have so many other means of communication. Now, for me in the campaign, it was clear I needed to be able to get my message and show who I was to Warringah, to get people on board to trust me, to represent them. Now, clearly through social medias, we have so many platforms, and these are not platforms controlled by a limited few. These are available to you. So I think there is a way of taking back control of that narrative and that process, but you have to be prepared to work hard at it. So yes, email your MP, which is why for the climate bill we have the climateactnow.com.au, which to help you do that, facilitate that. But follow up. If you're part of a tennis club or a PNC group, if you have a local forum for your area, whatever your group, if you don't have one, start one. Start your kitchen table conversation. Get your community engaged on the issues.
And I'd imagine that that follow-up email, if you then say, look, there's 35 of us from our group that want to come in and meet with you, that's going to be far more powerful than just a generic sort of petition that you're sending in. So it does take more work. Yeah, that's good to hear. Zali, I know we haven't got a lot of time. There's a few questions that have come through, so I might just ask you some of those. So one of the questions has come through from Adam Clark, who says, what's the timeline to bring the Climate Act to the House now, given everything that's happened with COVID?
Yeah, look, a lot of people asking me that question. look, I've made a few amendments to the bill to ensure that I take into account the feedback I've had from bodies, but also some of the other MPs that I've talked to. And then I also want to make sure I go through a consultation process, because it's really important that this is up to date with the current situation of where we're at. But I also have a lot of people who want to be able to come to Canberra, so I can't do it while there's a period of lockdown. So it will be mid to end of this year. It's definitely going to be 2020. Don't you worry about that. I just want to give time to make sure there's the right level of consultation and the right opportunity to address the challenges that we're facing. The irony is that the crisis and the lockdown has created the change in behaviour that is so hard to achieve in normal times. So I would encourage everyone to, grasp onto that. Like, I know, Damien, you've talked a lot about changing behaviour, changing our use of our cars and transport, and can we have more modern work practices, more flexible, more work from home. There's been a lot of things we've changed and adjusted in this crisis that we can take forward.
Predictions are our emissions are going to drop about 8% this year, and that's kind of the figure. We've got to drop them by 7% every year till 2030 if we're going to meet our Paris goals. So it's a good indication of what we should be doing, and this is what happens when the whole system shuts down. We've got to do more of this. Yeah,
but unfortunately the concern is we've had a reduction of emissions, but there is a real concern that there will be a peak, a steeper rise in emissions post-lockdown because of, for example, an increased use of private vehicles instead of public transport, loosening of regulations around manufacturing. So there is a risk of a long-term negative impact if we're not watchful.
Yeah, I think the emissions post-GFC went up 5%, even though they dropped 1% and everyone got excited. They just flew back up very quickly. Another question's coming here. How could federal money drive down carbon, fund transitional employment and reboot the fire-ravaged towns? So I guess it's sort of tying in the momentum post-bushfires with COVID. How do we is there an opportunity to tie those together?
Yeah, well, I think there's rebuilding going on. So that rebuilding brings opportunity, but we need to rebuild smart. And if there is going to be regional investment, it should be in areas that have as a focus a decarbonisation. I mean, there's a lot of talk around from a manufacturing point of view, really looking at green steel, green aluminium, mentioned before battery production. There's clearly a lot of regional communities are needing a huge amount of assistance. I mean, we saw the impact of loss of power during the bushfires was quite significant. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. Now, do you rebuild the same or do you rebuild better? Clearly, by rebuilding better, you create local jobs. I would argue we need to rebuild with renewables if it comes from an energy supply point of view, and that achieves, so the money in the rebuild is spent on lower emission technology. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think transport's an interesting one. We've had a lot of conversation around our airlines, and we need airline travel in Australia. We're a vast continent, but it does open the question of also investment, I think, in our rail, and especially a high-speed rail. So we have a lot of conversation about accelerating infrastructure projects, and roads is what the government's generally spoken about. But we know from a long-term point of view, we actually need a better rail network. We have a quite old rail network that needs upgrading. So that would be something that can create jobs and increase transport capacity very quickly, especially along the East Coast. And then looking at modernising our transport. And, look, the government was due to release its technology roadmap prior to the crisis. I think it's more relevant than ever that we know what are the technologies it believes will achieve the Paris Agreement target of reducing our emissions, and let's make sure that our stimulus spend is actually done consistent to that. There's a lot of ways in which this can all work together.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting seeing what some other countries are doing that I guess you could argue might have been quite radical even 6 months ago. I mean, I think Spain are going to implement a universal basic income. They've actually just released, I think, their announcement today to no more expansion of any sort of fossil fuel. We've seen Amsterdam are even going to implement Kate Raworth's donut economics as they rebuild from Corona. But just get the sense here, I mean, obviously we've got a conservative government in place, but we just aren't thinking in those radical ways. It feels like we're really sort of just going to go back or double down on the system we had and potentially waste this really beautiful opportunity. Do you think that there's still reasons for hope outside the sort of the national decisions? Do you think there are exciting opportunities that will emerge from this?
Yeah, look, I think that if there's one thing the government's been clear is it said, look, there's so much of the stimulus is going to come from public funding, from Commonwealth money, but it wants the private sector to come on board as well. It needs the private sector to invest. Now, much of the private sector is absolutely committed to decarbonising, to low emission technologies. Large corporations, we see announcements all the time of needing to get to that net zero. I mean, during the crisis, we saw AGL is really stuck between a rock and a hard place, between being punished by shareholders that it is not moving quickly enough in its reducing its emissions and decarbonising and moving away. But yet the government is not releasing the plan on Liddell and not permitting timely closure and transition. So large corporates are, they are under pressure from their employees that want to have good corporate policy. Their shareholders certainly want to know that there isn't, the exposure to climate risk is being addressed. The growth and acceptance of the TCFD is really interesting in where that's doing. So, and then there's liability for a lot of companies. So I think the private sector is miles ahead of the government. I think the government is going to have a rude shock if it wants to put public money in projects that are simply uncommercial. It's simply not going to attract the private funding, and that's a reality. So yes, there's plenty to be hopeful about. I think there's already been some really interesting development and decisions. The fact that other countries are leading the way, I am hopeful. I mean, the IMF came out today saying again, the stimulus and the rebuilds need to be low emission technologies. There's a lot of hope. I think the world can't afford to waste money on old technologies, on uncommercial, unviable. We knew they were already on track to being stranded technologies. I think that's been accelerated by the crisis. I don't think there's a choice.
No, and I think too that what it's really laid bare, not only the fragility of the system and the flaws in it, but also I think what we really do value and what's been important this moment has been, the doctors and the nurses, food, teachers, these things that we've often undervalued, some of them. Do you think there's that we won't go back in a sense that they'll be valued as we move forward, and we're going to have more pandemics, we're going to have more climate shocks? Do you think that we're going to need to build in something more robust to the system and have a safety net and a protection for people? Is that on the agenda for discussion as we emerge, do you think?
Look, it'll be interesting. I mean, we certainly saw the Adam Band and the Greens come out with their plan. I don't know that I would agree that we're going to have a complete, change to our social fabric and everything. But I think we have come to appreciate that there's certainly certain industries and sectors that we need to better value. And when it comes to job security or where the opportunities in the future are, clearly there are certain sectors that are going to need to be, that the youth will see as being much better employment prospects in areas to go in. So that will create demand as well. And demand is definitely, from a nursing point of view, we've seen in those frontline staff essential. We've seen the breakdown of supply lines in terms of manufacturing and what are essential products that we need to really make sure we have in Australia. Also diversifying our maybe trading partners and supply lines. I think we've been, we've really shown that there are weaknesses there and that we need to make sure that is a little bit more secure. So I think there's going to be some really interesting opportunities there. And it is about how do we look to the future, and I think we just have to make sure it's sound for the future. But look, over the bushfires in the summer, we had our first climate refugees, Malakuta, a whole community evacuating from a beach. That, it was our way of life that I think a lot of people take for granted, that we live in an amazing country. We take for granted a right to clean air. I think, I hope there is a deep reset for what do we value and what do we prioritise.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And stay tuned. We'll keep you posted and we'll send some more information out about Zali's Climate Act and when it will be pushed into the parliament. So get behind it, support, get your group together and harass your MP. Thanks for listening.
Thanks to the 2040 team for letting us share this adaptation of their ongoing webinars with you. You can find out more about the Climate Act at climateactnow.com.au and find a link to it, the webinar video, and more from the 2040 team in the show notes. So if you're also feeling inspired to take action, join me. Let's call our local MP, get a conversation about the Climate Act happening in our local community groups. And now we're starting to venture out of our homes. How about we post up flyers, which you can find on the website, around our local area as well. The steps we take now will determine what kind of world we'll have when we reach 2040. Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Climactic, the flagship podcast of the Climactic Collective, a podcast network dedicated to lifting the voices of the climate community. You can find out more about the people behind Climactic and all the shows we produce at climactic.fm. We are a social enterprise podcast network, and we greatly appreciate your support. You can find a link to our Pozible where you can support us directly in the show notes of this episode or from our website. Thank you for listening, and from the whole Climactic Collective, keep up the great work and take care of each other in these climactic times.
The Climactic Collective.